Okay, I think it's 3 o'clock. We'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this session. I realize we're getting towards the end of the event. Everyone's probably a little bit tired after last night and lunch. And let's face it, there's plenty of other great sessions on. So really pleased to see all of you here today. So my name's Matthew Aslett. I'm Research Director for Data Platforms and Analytics at 451 Research. And actually had the pleasure of being part of the keynote presentation at the first Hadoop Summit Europe back in 2013. And what's interesting actually is, as I remember it, with the slightly different shapes, obviously, but the room for the keynote at that event was not that much bigger than this room. Obviously, had a few more people in it. So again, quality rather than quantity. But again, thank you. But it does show how far the event has come and how far Hadoop in Europe has come over the last few years. Although, having said that, obviously the main social event then was at a brewery, so clearly things don't change that much. So before I get into the presentation, talking about Hadoop and other animals and the way Hadoop is evolving, just briefly introduce you to 451 Research for any of you who've not come across the company before. So we are an IT research and advisory company, so we compete with companies like Gartner and IDC and Forrester. Obviously, they're a little bit bigger than us. We think, depending which way you cut it, we're about the fourth largest IT advisory firm. We've got about 250 employees, over 100 which are analysts. We think what differentiates us and what our clients tell us differentiates us from some of the other larger advisory firms is our focus on innovation and new technologies and new companies. And we've been covering Hadoop and NoSQL since the very early stages. Not quite 10 years in terms of Hadoop, but pretty close. We've got, as you see there, about 1,000 clients, which includes technology vendors and service providers, also people in corporate advisory roles, professional services, and of course IT decision makers. And the last thing I'll point to on this slide, but the most important one in some ways is that next one, 50,000 plus IT professionals, business users, and consumers who are part of our research community. So these are not necessarily customers of 451 Research, although some are, but they are IT practitioners, IT users, so some of those are consumer users, but they engage with us in terms of questionnaires and surveys and direct interviews, and that community really increasingly shapes our perspective on the industry. Just one last thing in terms of 451. So we offer research and data across the whole of the industries, we say from the kind of the core to the edge, across 15 channels. And as I say, the channel I'm responsible for is almost slap bang in the middle there, the Data Platforms and Analytics channel. So getting on to the presentation itself. So this is part of the Future of Hadoop track, and I've been in a number of the sessions over the last couple of days of that track, trying to figure out where Hadoop is going. And obviously a lot of those are being quite technical about where the technology of Hadoop is going. I'm going to say this right from the outset, this is not a technical presentation. I'm not talking about the technology of Hadoop so much and where that's going in terms of, but rather the meaning of Hadoop and what we understand by Hadoop and how that has evolved over time and how it will continue to do so. I'll also talk a little bit about comparisons of Hadoop distributions, and one of the things we're very interested in is the business strategies, the business models around particularly open source technologies, but any new technologies. And I'll talk a little bit about that, how that's evolved and how that might continue to evolve over time. I've started talking a lot in the last 6 months to a year about converging data platforms. And Hadoop is very much kind of a core component of that. And that's shaping the future evolution of Hadoop. And then kind of getting beyond the zoo, beyond talking about different animals, and the increased focus within the industry, and particularly within vendors within the Hadoop industry, on use cases rather than sort of individual projects. So that's some of the things that I'll be talking about. The first thing is to kind of consider, what do we mean when we say Hadoop? I guess probably the word Hadoop has probably been used thousands, possibly millions of times in the last 2 days. And there's kind of an assumption that everybody understands what is meant by that. But actually what is meant by Hadoop and what the Hadoop means has evolved over time, over the last 10 years. As Arun mentioned in the keynote yesterday, actually, initially, Hadoop, it was pretty clear what Hadoop was. It was the Hadoop distributed file system. It was Hadoop MapReduce, and then less focus on, but still importantly, the Hadoop common set of utilities. And then over time, as the ecosystem has evolved, the term Hadoop has really evolved as well to become kind of a catch-all brand for this wider distributed processing ecosystem, and that encompasses beyond MapReduce, beyond HDFS, a mix of different data processing and storage capabilities. And obviously we've kind of observed this, but also it's really interesting if you have a chance to either hear Doug Cutting talk about this or speak to Doug Cutting about this. It's got interesting opinions about where Hadoop has come and where Hadoop is going. And of course, it's a man whose opinions you should listen to in relation to Hadoop, given that he was one of the co-creators of it, and there he is with the original Hadoop elephant that the Hadoop project is named after. As a quick aside, it is worth talking to Doug, especially about Hadoop, because he pronounces it completely differently from anyone else, and we've all been pronouncing it wrong. It's not Hadoop, it's Hadoop, but he's not too precious about that. He doesn't really mind, and we all carry on saying it however we like. But I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, and Doug was talking about this, the evolution of Hadoop and where it's going. And he said a few things that really interested me and fit nicely into what I was planning to talk about. And one of those was that, from his view, there are two things really that people mean by Hadoop, and really supporting, what I've already outlined. There's, the Apache Hadoop project, the original Hadoop, the HDFS and Hadoop MapReduce. And then there's the set of technologies that are built around that. And really, people use Hadoop to refer to both of those things, sometimes simultaneously or at different times. That's the potential. It has theoretically the potential to be confusing, although most of the time you can figure out what people are talking about. It's not that much of a problem. Another way of looking at this is, I think we can all agree that this is definitely Hadoop. We've seen this cuddly yellow elephant, or I think it's white on the front here, around in various forms, and we can all agree that this is Hadoop. But of course, this is the symbol of the Hadoop core. This is the logo of the Hadoop core, not the broader Hadoop ecosystem. And if we talk about Hadoop and other animals, that broader Hadoop ecosystem involves a whole menagerie of different projects represented by different animals and different imagery related to those animals. So if we're talking about the Hadoop ecosystem rather than Hadoop, maybe we shouldn't be representing it with this cuddly yellow elephant. Maybe we should be representing it with something else, which is why I'm sort of proposing that we instead use this to represent the Hadoop ecosystem. Of course, I'm not actually proposing that at all, but it was fun to kind of throw this together and figure out what the broader Hadoop ecosystem might look like, because it clearly is not just the Hadoop elephant. It is beyond Hadoop, and it is another animal. It is another creature, and it's important, I think, especially for organizations that are coming new to this, to understand the differences between the broader Hadoop ecosystem and Hadoop itself. Another way of looking at this, I think it was about a year ago, I put together something at the time was calling the periodic table of Hadoop. For no apparent reason, I've started calling it the Hadoop table of elements instead. But it's a way of representing the Hadoop core and the various projects that make up the Hadoop ecosystem. So as you can see here, the core itself has evolved over time, to represent MapReduce, HDFS, and of course Yarn. And then beyond that, there's a whole set of different other Hadoop ecosystem projects, crossing things like processing and analytics and management, data management, security, and then just sort of other things that are part of the wider Hadoop ecosystem. And as you can see, there's what is interesting is that wider Hadoop ecosystem is clearly bigger than the Hadoop core, but also over time, that wider Hadoop ecosystem represents a much more significant part of, or proportion of the code and contributions that are happening around Hadoop. And MapReduce and HDFS themselves represent a decreasing proportion of the overall work and innovation that's happening in Hadoop. And this is less than half of it, because this is just the ASF-related ASF projects that are present in more than one Hadoop distribution. Actually, it's a much more significant and much broader table of elements. As you can see, I actually couldn't put all of it on here because it wouldn't all fit in one slide. So this is everything else that isn't on that previous slide. And these are all the other Hadoop-related Apache Software Foundation projects. Now, Hadoop-related is a bit of a, blurry term, fuzzy term. So how many are there? It depends how you count it and what you would count as Hadoop related. But by our way of looking at it, we're currently up to 64 different projects that could be considered part of the wider Hadoop ecosystem. And then it expands even further beyond that, because you've got then another bunch of technologies and projects and products that I tried to use a non-euphemistic term here, just talking about non-ASF Hadoop-related products and projects. So some of these could be open source, but not ASF. Well, obviously, a lot of them are proprietary. And I just picked a few just as kind of examples here. I mean, there's many, many more. We could fill up many, many more slides here. But, obviously, things like Cloudera Manager are clearly part of the Hadoop ecosystem, but, not necessarily part of Hadoop itself. MapR FS, the MapR file system, another prime example. In SQL on Hadoop, I mean, there's numerous examples of this with existing vendors bringing their technologies to Hadoop, IBM Big SQL being an example here. And then EMC Isilon, to represent kind of the larger sort of infrastructure, but also because it's, that HDFS compatibility, which Amazon S3 also has. So, there really is, when you think of trying to define the Hadoop ecosystem, it's vast and it's ever evolving, and you quickly get away from the core initial Hadoop projects. I kind of like this way of representing Hadoop. Obviously, I'm biased, but one of the ways I think it's quite useful is that in the same way, if you have, you take the periodic table of elements, you can take select element, or you don't take them, but multiple elements come together to form compounds. You can kind of do the same thing if you're thinking about Hadoop and the kind of use cases you might have for the various Hadoop projects. There we are. So for example, in a traditional kind of data engineering kind of Hadoop environment, you'd have the Hadoop core and then things like Hive and Tez and Pig. And obviously you'd have more than this, but I'm just trying to simplify things here. In a kind of for a search use case, you might be using Solr, and then you'd use Flume to get the data in there, and Zookeeper to help manage it all. Obviously, increasingly, people are looking at real-time projects, so Spark, Storm, Kafka, obviously NiFi, potentially relevant here as well. And part of this, the essence of this, what I want to talk about here is, what the meaning of the word Hadoop is that, these things are actually potentially quite different, and yet all of them are referred to as Hadoop, or all of them could be considered Hadoop. And you might have multiple different types of Hadoop, multiple Hadoop variants running within a single organization, and certainly across multiple organizations. The other reason to start thinking about what Hadoop means in relation to this is, what if you had your data in S3, and you're not going to pull it out of there and put it into Hadoop, but you do want to analyze that, and you might spin up Impala to analyze that data. Is that Hadoop? And if it's not Hadoop, then what is it? Does that really matter? I think, arguably not, but obviously increasingly as we see organizations wanting to process data in the cloud, and people talk about hybrid cloud deployments, Hadoop running across multiple environments on premises and cloud, this is going to become potentially increasingly relevant to try and define what it is you're trying to do and what you're using to try and do that. And it is definitely, potentially relevant in that, as I said, a lot less focus is placed now on MapReduce and HDFS in terms of the overall development, work going into the Hadoop ecosystem. And another interesting thing that Doug said at this talk recently was that if people stop using MapReduce and HDFS, we'll let them disappear, and we're not religious about that. And I think, this is one of those occasions where Doug, in my view anyway, was talking both as sort of an employee of Cloudera. Cloudera is not particularly religious about this, but also, in his role within the ASF and the Hadoop community, that as he saw it, the Hadoop community themselves didn't need to be religious about this. And we could, over time get to a point where the Hadoop Core, those core Hadoop projects, are no longer necessarily a really significant part of what people think about as being Hadoop. And beyond that as well, I mean, Doug's talked for many years actually about Hadoop evolving into this broader platform. And one of the other things he said was, as long as it's open source, we can bring it into this platform. And here I think he was talking very much, obviously, as a member of the ASF and the Hadoop community rather than Cloudera, because Cloudera obviously brings things in already that are not open source, but they have a very strict way of defining how that is done within the Cloudera products. Now, one of the things because I've discussed this with some of our clients as well, because we've had questions about this. And one of the things as well, is this really that much of an issue? Does it really matter? Because after all, not many people, some organizations clearly do actually pick projects and combine them together to create a Hadoop environment. But in most cases, a lot of cases, organizations are actually using a Hadoop distribution. And if you're using a Hadoop distribution or parts of it, then therefore, clearly you're using Hadoop. So it's worth looking a little bit at the evolution of Hadoop distributions and the way those have evolved and where they might be heading as well. So, as I say, we've been tracking this for many years, just before actually the formation of Cloudera. And obviously Cloudera, the first commercial Hadoop distribution with what was known as Cloudera distribution for Hadoop, and now more recently known as CDH. The next distribution of Hadoop, often forgotten actually, was the Yahoo distribution of Hadoop. As you can see, it lasted just a couple of years before Yahoo figured out actually it was better to work, to contribute into the Apache Hadoop project rather than try and, do anything different. And you can see that as kind of a forerunner or the cousin, I suppose, of obviously the Hortonworks data platform. Then, as time went on, we saw IBM enter the market in 2010. Early 2011, EMC then obviously evolved over time to be Pivotal HD. And then MapR with launching soon afterwards with its distribution of Hadoop, which actually EMC had used for the Greenplum HD Enterprise Edition, just above it. And then there's another group of distributions that kind of came and went in quite quick time. The WANDisco distro holds the record for the shortest lifespan of any Hadoop distribution, actually under a year, although I think we're given the benefit of the doubt that they did that just to kind of prove some of their other capabilities and demonstrate that, and obviously they then entered partnerships with Hortonworks and others. The Intel, they were actually doing some stuff in China before this, but when they went global with it, that's when we kind of said they started off here with a distribution of Hadoop. Obviously, they invested in Cloudera and partnering with Cloudera, so that didn't last too long. And then Teradata open distribution for Hadoop, which was very specifically focused on the Cloudera appliance for Hadoop, and was designed to overcome some of the what was seen then as limitations, but obviously as Cloudera and Hortonworks and the Apache Hadoop evolved, it became unnecessary. So they discontinued that and then into partnerships with Cloudera, Hortonworks, and MapR. So I was trying to figure out earlier, I think at any one time there were possibly 9, but 8 Hadoop distributions. But some of those have come and gone, and definitely what we've seen is that expansion and contraction. And clearly we saw the next step, a significant or obvious step in relation to that on Monday when Pivotal announced that they were discontinuing Pivotal HD and instead going to resell Pivotal HDP, which I was particularly pleased to see they announced on Monday because I thought they were going to announce it about a month ago. And so this would have been quite an awkward part of the presentation had they not actually announced it on Monday. So, clearly what we see is that it was almost kind of inevitable over time as you watched Pivotal's strategy, obviously engaging with the ODPI, working with Hortonworks, adopting Ambari instead of what was called the Pivotal console or the Greenplum console. It was just a natural progression. The other point here is, you may have noticed the MapR distribution line ends at the beginning of 2016, and this is something that's gone relatively unnoticed, actually, in terms of the press and other analysts that I've seen, is that MapR obviously introduced the Converged data platform at the end of 2015. And at that point, they actually effectively ceased to be a Hadoop distributor. And I want to be very clear about this because they still distribute Hadoop projects within that MapR Converged data platform. And indeed, they've been quite open about this. They still identify what those projects are that are in the MapR Converged data platform, and they refer to that as Apache for Hadoop for the MapR Converged data platform. But what you can't do anymore is download, a distribution that includes all of those projects. So MapR is still distributing Apache Hadoop projects, but they're actually no longer a Hadoop distributor. So effectively, what we've come down to, despite that expansion up to 9 distributions over a short space of time, is really down to 3: Cloudera, IBM Open Platform with Apache Hadoop, and the Hortonworks data platform. Now, obviously, IBM is also an ODPI member. I think it's possible over time we may see IBM doing a pivotal, if you like. I've no particular reason to believe that will happen at this point, but certainly if you look at the different distributions and what's in them, clearly the IBM Open Platform with Apache Hadoop is a subset of HDP, and the additional value that IBM provides comes in the form of Big Insights and the Big Insights family, which runs on top of that distribution. So, it's certainly possible, I think, that we're heading in a similar direction again. Back to the table of Hadoop elements. This is also one of the reasons I like this is because it was really a great keynote I thought this morning about being able to understand things by visualizing them. And it's one thing to have a list of Hadoop projects in different distributions and try and figure out what's in one and not in the other. It's a lot easier if you lay it out like this. So this represents the projects in the later, or at least it was the latest when I looked. So apologies, obviously, if it's slightly out of date, but it wasn't that long ago, so hopefully it's not. The latest version of the Hortonworks data platform. And you compare that to the IBM Open Platform. What you can see is, effectively IBM is a subset of HDP. There's 17 projects in common. There's a few missing. There's one that isn't in HDP, which is Parquet, the project itself. But effectively, it is a subset of HDP. Compare that, obviously, with Cloudera, and things begin to look a little bit different. There's 15 projects in common. So there's still this underlying, I hesitate to use the word core, because you've got the Hadoop core and you've got the ODPI core, but there's a common group of projects across all of these distributions. But obviously, Cloudera has 6 ASF projects within its distribution that aren't in HDP. There's a number of other, they're actually all open source, but they're not ASF projects, Kite, Llama, and Cloudera Search, which are part of the Cloudera distribution. And there's an odd thing, actually, that Kafka is not part of CDH, although it is supported as part of Cloudera Enterprise. So I'm not sure how that comes about. It may change over time. I'm sure they've got very good reasons for doing that, but that's the way it is. Another way of looking at this is not what have they got in common, but how are they different? And this is when we begin to think about the potential bifurcation of Hadoop. And really it coming down to Hortonworks and Cloudera, primarily obviously as the main distributors here. And we see that in HDP there's 11 ASF projects not in CDH, and there's also a couple of things cascading in Cloudbreak as well. In CDH, there's, as I said, 6 ASF projects not in HDP. There's Kite, Llama, and Cloudera Search, and also added on here, obviously the primary proprietary capabilities that Cloudera offers within Cloudera Enterprise, Cloudera Manager, Navigator, and Director. I don't want to make too much of this, but I think what is becoming increasingly obvious to me is that we are heading towards a world where, clearly we're not going to have 2 Hadoops, but there is increasing difference between the Hortonworks distribution of Hadoop Hortonworks Data Platform, obviously, and Cloudera CDH. And some of these, you could argue it's just a matter of, they haven't included it in the distribution yet. I mentioned Kafka isn't in CDH, but is supported by Cloudera. In a lot of other cases, though, we are actually talking about functionality, particularly obviously included within HDP, that isn't in CDH because it competes directly with what Cloudera offers with their products within Cloudera Enterprise. So I think this is going to become increasingly relevant for Hadoop users in terms of choosing between the major distributions. Up until now, we talked to clients why they chose one over the other. There's various things. Obviously, in a lot of cases, they want it to be as close to Apache as possible, and that's important. Apache Hadoop as possible. That's important to them. It's just that the at least theoretical benefit of being able to change to another distribution. For others, it's about price. For others, it's just about the ease of working with the vendor. But increasingly, companies are going to have to actually think about what projects they're taking advantage of, what projects they're using, and whether whether Cloudera or Hortonworks are actually supporting those technologies. So that's at least the potential if we think about the future of Hadoop in terms of bifurcation. The other area, which seems slightly contradictory, but as I said, we've been talking about a lot in the last 6 months or so within 451 research, is about convergence and converging data platforms. And there's, obviously you can divide up the areas that we cover in various ways, but if you think about the core data platforms, distributed data grid cache, NoSQL, relational database, relational operational database, analytic database, Hadoop, stream processing, and containerization is a bit of an anomaly, but it's increasingly relevant. I was just in the session earlier in terms of containerization, containers, and Hadoop, and it is definitely relevant in terms of how we think about how these platforms are going to evolve and how they're going to be deployed. And we definitely see, particularly talking to some of our very largest clients who are making significant decisions about their long-term data platforms. They're not looking for, a single platform from a single vendor, but they are thinking about these various platforms, potentially as a whole. And with the way, some of the reasons for that, obviously, traditionally it's always been about the operational relational database management system, the analytic database management system. Hadoop came in and didn't quite push them to the side, but found its own space in that environment. And I must say, the size of these blocks has got nothing to do with importance or anything like that. It just, you'll see why I've done it that way. Then obviously you've got various NoSQL databases alongside, but increasingly potentially on top of that, and even distributed relational databases as well. And what we've seen is increasingly the vendors and the projects in this space are looking to take advantage of increased integration with Hadoop and Spark. Not necessarily running in the same cluster, but certainly, as I said, we've got both the vendors and a lot of the end users we talk to who are thinking about this as a cohesive whole, even if it's not a single platform. Federated query is obviously an important factor here as well, enabling organizations to query data in the analytic database and Hadoop at the same time. Clearly still different platforms, but connected and somewhat converged. And just at the NoSQL level, obviously one of the things we've been looking at for a while is the evolution towards multi-model databases rather than individual document key value graph stores, although those continue to be relevant in particular use cases. Clearly there is an evolution towards, as I say, convergence, at least at that level and beyond. And then lastly, I'll just drop this in here. This is more about how we expect to see the market evolving in terms of taking advantage of data center operating system technologies like Mesos. Obviously, containerization, Docker is particularly relevant here. And again, I was just in the session earlier talking about the future use of Docker containers within Yarn to isolate different engines running on Hadoop. So another way of looking at that, there's back to the Hadoop related projects. At this point, they're excuse me, you can map them into different areas here, but with the convergence that we see, these clearly are potentially coming together into a converging data platform, or I use here C something data platform. It's not clear what this will be termed as in the long term, or called in the long term, but it seems quite obvious it's going to begin with the letter C, because you've got MapR talking about the converged data platform. You've got Hortonworks obviously talking about connected data platforms at the moment, very much about real-time and batch, but that, I suspect, will evolve over time as well. Is it inevitable that Cloudera just calls it the Cloudera data platform? I doubt it, but they could. It would make sense. And then everyone can talk about CDP, and nobody have any idea what anybody's talking about. I actually started using the term informally, a chimeric data platform. From the word chimera, which comes from Greek mythology, which means it's a multi-headed hybrid creature composed of the parts of more than one animal. And then you can see how our graphic from earlier really comes into play, and that we are talking that wider ecosystem actually represents potentially not just a different animal from the Hadoop elephant itself, but something to be considered a separate and larger platform. And the other reason I like the term chimeric data platform is that Merriam-Webster dictionary defines a chimera as something that exists only in the imagination and that is not possible in reality, which just appeals to my sense of humor, and is, a valid question to ask. Are we really seriously talking about a single platform that can deliver all of these capabilities? Certainly not in the short term, but as I said, in terms of some of the ways that some of our clients are thinking about this and talking to us about this, in terms of some of the vendor strategies, we certainly see that this is the way in which the world is moving. How that might play out in the shorter term is a little bit different. I'll go back to our table of Hadoop elements for this, as I said, rather than focusing on projects, rather than talking about kind of all the different zoo animals, to think more about the kind of the use cases. And Hadoop, or the Hadoop ecosystem, not necessarily being a single platform that can deliver on all of those capabilities, but a platform made up of multiple projects from which you can carve out different sets of capabilities that can deliver against particular use cases. So back to what I was talking about earlier, you can see you can carve out a set of projects that could be used for Hadoop for data engineering, a set of projects that can be used for Hadoop for search, a set of projects for Hadoop for operational applications. And again, this is simplified, there would be other things involved. Or a set of projects that might be used for Hadoop for stream processing. And you can think of other examples for this. I mean, arguably, we heard a lot the last couple of days about Metron from the Hortonworks project, or Cloudera also working on what do they call it, Open Network Initiative or ONI project. I forget exactly what it stands for. But basically, cybersecurity is clearly an area where I think we will see the Hadoop distributors focusing on with a subset or a set of components and projects from across that wider that wider ecosystem. And so, yes, we do see, in the long term, the convergence of projects towards, let's just call it for now a chimeric data platform, but whatever it's called, it doesn't really matter. But the way in which that will be instantiated for a lot of organizations in the next couple of years is in terms of, subsets of capabilities delivered for very specific use cases. And I know for a fact that we will see this from some vendors. I'm confident in talking to some of the other vendors that will see this in the long term, whether it's in terms of kind of reference architecture or delivered as solutions, or in some cases it will be product SKUs. We will see Hadoop being specifically offered for different use cases in different combinations of projects. So that's all I have. Hopefully that was interesting, or if not, and also, I should say, thought-provoking. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm happy to, if anyone's got any questions, or if anybody wants to argue with me, I'm happy for that as well. Any comments or feedback? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good point, actually. I didn't mention big data, and I didn't mention data lakes, and I didn't mention the cloud. This is pretty good. We do see cloud is definitely increasingly relevant in terms of Hadoop. Obviously, by far, the most Hadoop deployments we've seen to date have been on premises, on commodity server infrastructure. That said, obviously, Elastic, or EMR, as we're now supposed to call it, from AWS is clearly a significant player here. And I've actually, in terms of the distribution, I've got a larger chart which includes the cloud service providers as well. They're definitely going to play an increasing role. I think the first set of Hadoop as a service offerings we've seen have actually been targeted mainly at the same people, people mainly at this kind of event, the same people who were using Hadoop on premises. It was all about, you still had to have a level of skill to use that and to manage and configure that, even if it made things easier in terms of actually, spinning up the infrastructure or not in that case and deploying it. I think, in the long term, we see a bigger role for, if we think about Hadoop as it becomes adopted by later adopters that don't have those skill sets in-house. Managed services are obviously going to be relevant to them, and I think Qbol is working towards that. I think Altiscale just recently was interesting. Them introducing what do they call it, the Insight Cloud, I think, which was very much, it's not just a Hadoop service, it's an analytics service targeting that. So I think we'll see an increasing number of those. Cloudera is definitely getting more serious about cloud, as it should do, given its name. How exactly that will play out is not clear at this point. I know, talking to Hortonworks over the last couple of days, it's definitely a really interesting opportunity, especially for Hortonworks, in that it enables the company to potentially deliver value-added services literally delivered as a service, whilst maintaining, obviously, clearly its commitment to open source. I think what you might see is not necessarily here's another Hadoop as a service offering and get it from us rather than Amazon or Qbol or Google, but here's a service designed for a specific use case. Again, obviously in terms of the early adoption, archiving is one of those. Obviously, clearly any data set that's in the cloud already, it makes sense to also use a cloud service to actually process and analyze that as well. So that's some of the things we see, but it's very much a moving target, so it's definitely going to be interesting for the evolution as well. Thanks. Any other questions? Or, yes?
What's the trends on the commercial models or the partnership models that you see evolving among different Hadoop providers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, obviously, if we look at, as I said, primarily we're coming down to Cloudera and Hortonworks, and I'm sure people know the difference in their models. Obviously, Hortonworks, everything open source. Cloudera, everything to do with the data layer is open source. Anything to do with operations is not. I don't see those changing anytime soon. In terms of the partnerships, that is evolving. I mentioned, EMC Isilon earlier. I think, EMC was, 2-3 years ago, was making a big noise about HDFS compatibility, and why not use Isilon instead of HDFS? And Cloudera and Hortonworks and everyone else was like, we're not really interested. But what they saw over time was that those organizations that have deployed Isilon already and are taking advantage of Isilon already were like, no, actually, we do want to take advantage of this. And so you saw the partnerships emerge then to take advantage of that, to serve a specific set of customers that do want to use those. I think it was interesting, again on Monday, Hortonworks announcing the partnership with SyncSort to actually resell DMX-H, which is the first time Hortonworks will be reselling something that isn't open source, although it's going to be more of a sell-through, so they're keeping their hands away from that in terms of not getting involved in the non-open source stuff. But that's another example of how it's a very specific group of users that have a lot of mainframe data that need to get that or want to get that into Hadoop, and so it makes sense for the partnership to emerge there to serve that. Systems integrators obviously getting more and more involved. Other Second-tier cloud providers getting more and more involved. They definitely see that I'm going to use the term big data is an opportunity for them potentially to compete with Amazon and Google. So I think these partnerships are evolving, but I don't think it will have a significant impact on the business strategies of the core Hadoop distributors. Does that answer the question? Or if not,
Do you see any shift on the traditional data warehousing then?
a shift from them in terms of responding? Well, obviously, I mean, if you look at Teradata, here and their investment in Think Big and the consulting and an increasing amount of business they're doing around Hadoop. Well, Hadoop and data warehouse deployments, I mean, because it isn't a matter of one or the other. So yes, that's evolving. I mean, Oracle doing pretty good business actually initially in Europe with the big data appliance. I think you'll see that strategy evolve over time. So yeah, and they are changing. It is changing, but it's actually the pace of change in terms of the bigger picture. I mean, the bulk of revenue in this space is clearly still generated by traditional analytic database products. And it is going to change over time, but it's going to take a long time. And therefore, the strategies from the big vendors will change, but they'll take a long time as well. There's time up, but I'm glad to take any more questions at the front here or throughout the rest of the day. Thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you.